people think big, right? So if you look at some of the most successful people in the world, they don't talk about incremental goals. So this idea that they're going to move forward a very small bit, a very small bit. They don't talk about 2 years' time. They don't talk about the next promotion. They have this big vision that they're ultimately aiming for. And then I think the second thing is habits. And that's where the take small steps comes from. So the idea that actually, yes, you have this big goal where there's no constraints, where you have this kind of blue sky thinking. But to get there, the only way you're going to get there is to embed really good habits in your day-to-day, in your day-to-day. And that doesn't mean working for now all the time. It means working for the future.
All right, let's kick off. Grace, thank you so much for agreeing to doing this again. I can't believe, firstly, you're from not just from Ireland, but you're also from Cork, which is crazy. But the parallels between your work and my podcast have been, monumental. As I mentioned, my show has always been specializing in careers for young people. Your work has done the exact same thing, and I feel that what I've been trying to do is kind of live through those experiences, almost kind of in practice, and trying to improve what I've learned from guests on my show, experts like yourself, whether they're founders or entrepreneurs. But it's really cool because your stuff really focuses on the academic side of it, and then not just theory, but also the practice of it. So again, this is going to be a very good experience.
Thank you. And thank you, Darren, for having me on. And I guess it's interesting. So it's unusual to meet other people from Cork because very few people actually leave Cork. It's a really cool place to live. So yeah, for me as well, it's absolutely amazing that we come from the same place.
So I've always been tracking your work, and you've been at LSE for so many years, and you've always been working really hard in that particular area. But I'd like to really start on kind of career discovery in particular. So even speaking from my own experiences, so getting the right path and kind of getting onto the right trajectory has always been a struggle for me. I think it's a combination of having multiple options, which is a good and a negative thing. And I feel that for a lot of younger people, they kind of can rush into particular areas, rush into particular roles, and there's a lot of pressure. We'll get into a lot of great things around this as well. But even from a very basic path, how do you find students coming into the working world, how to try to discover that right path and get onto the right path from an early age, really?
I mean, I think it's interesting. So firstly, the world of work is changing. So you're right. There's a lot more opportunities open for people, and there's many new jobs being created that weren't there 10 years ago. So I think that in itself makes it difficult to choose a career. But what I always find fascinating when I talk to people about the job that they want to do is that they have a very bad idea of what they will do on a day-to-day basis. So what the tasks are. And I think for people who are struggling, they should try to reflect on what they enjoy doing on a day-to-day basis. So what if you could spend your time doing activities to get paid, what would those activities be? And then figuring out the jobs that allow you to do those activities and do those tasks. And if people take that approach, rather than saying, I want to be a lawyer, I want to be a public speaker, I want to be an entrepreneur, if they take that approach, everything becomes easier because you don't then need ever to have a label over your head as a job. So you don't need to be called one thing, but you're somebody who does those particular tasks. So you can then be looking on the horizon and saying, actually, I'm not that happy in this sector. I'm not that happy in this job. I'm not that happy with this company. But I'm going to go and use what I've learned in these tasks and do it somewhere else. And that is two things. You're job crafting, so you're crafting the job for yourself. But secondly, it allows you to transfer very easily in today's economy where things actually can get quite difficult.
That's very, very interesting because a lot of things that a lot of the young people don't really know the tasks they're going to be doing. They'll go into companies and they'll kind of fall into those paths, and like things are changing and evolving so quickly that you can often get siloed. And even my own experience, I went into big consulting. I felt kind of rushed into it. A lot of my friends were getting jobs, and I felt like I didn't think about it clearly. But if I took a step back and looked at the tasks I would be doing, and it's very hard to know that from a zoomed out perspective, to see what is your day to day. And referencing like your book, Think Big, has been fantastic with this because it's really focused in on what are the real tasks and what do you enjoy doing, and that's very, very difficult as well. But I think even at the interview stage, people don't ask those types of questions, and then they'll lead themselves into going into roles and then obviously end up being pretty much disgruntled and not being that interested in it. And then not necessarily wanting to swap industry or swap roles. So how do you kind of like proportion that? Because if it's task driven, people don't really know what the opportunities are elsewhere as well.
So I think the first thing is that people need to figure out what they can control in life and what they can't when it comes to their career. And you can absolutely control learning more about other jobs. So you can find out very easily what are the tasks of other jobs. I would say every week I answer an email where somebody asks me what I do on a day-to-day basis. And I've met people to talk about my job. So there's no reason why more people can't do that. So if you don't know what other jobs tasks are, go and find out about it. And, you know, the good thing about today's economy is that there's YouTube that will tell you. So you can Google a day in the life of X, whatever you want to be, and you'll be able to see somebody talk about a day in the life of X. So you don't even have to put yourself out there in the way that people are when they approach me. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that, you know, as human beings, we fall into status quo, and we tend to stay in the status quo, and we don't necessarily recognize the choices that are available to us in the world. And I think knowing what your opportunities are, what your options are at every single point, even when you're happy with your job, will fundamentally mean that you'll have a better career, both in terms of, and I hate talking about happiness at work, and we can go into why that is in a while, both in terms of having a job that you are content with or satisfied in, and secondly, also in terms of financial reward, which ultimately a lot of people do end up disgruntled because they feel that they're underpaid, particularly today when we're suffering a lot of inflation here in the UK and in many other countries. So I think just bear in mind two things. You can always find out what's happening in other jobs. There's always time for that. And the second part is, unless you nudge yourself in life, you will stay in the status quo. And if you stay in the status quo and you complain about your job day in, day out, then the only person to blame for that is you. There's nobody else in the world who's holding you there.
Yeah, 100%. And I think we'll get into a load of that as well about kind of thinking independently. It's a huge area I want to discuss. But even bringing it back, because I want to kind of focus on like the kind of mindset and kind of psychology aspect of it, because that's, you know, it's an exceptional area of your work that you focus on. But getting stuck in that kind of status quo is it's a terrifying thought, because a lot of people end up being lawyers because they had a vague idea when they were 14, or they want to become a dentist because their parents are dentists or whatnot. They don't necessarily look at the opportunities. But the way I try to see it is like, what is it between those cracks that I actually want? Is it the career success? Is it the you know, the job title? Is it the salary that you want, versus like following tradition? I think that was the biggest thing for me, was kind of defining success in my whole way. And especially anything that's kind of entrepreneurial is always very much independent, because you have to figure it out on the go. Yeah. But if you go through the kind of straight up kind of traditional path, where I felt as well that I didn't really get much enjoyment from was the fact that it was very systematic. You know, I would spend 2 years at this level, 2 years at this level. I would get a 7% increase in wage at this point, regardless if I worked exceptional or just good. And that was the biggest caveat to kind of that overall. And then I kind of felt that because I was not thinking independently, and because I was not trying to push the boundaries, therefore I fell back into the status quo and to the median bracket. And that's where I kind of, left with a lot of my most unfulfillment and a lack of purpose. And I think it was taking a step back, not necessarily listening to my closest friends, because, you know, we're all kind of very much influenced by others, but seeing what is the greatest opportunities I wanted, which is a career in like fintech, a career merged with my interest in technology, with my kind of, you know, overall kind of personality of chatting to people, chatting to you, and engaging with people is what I enjoy, and following that pursuit. And I think that's what led me to this point, versus, oh, this seems like a good idea and I should just follow going doing that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you don't necessarily take advice from your friends. I think that is correct, because your friends are probably too like you to see more opportunities for you. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing as well is that there'll be a few different types of people. So I think if you're somebody who wants to work to live, basically, so that you want to bring kind of home a paycheck, if you can find a job that gives you work-life balance, the 7% increase in pay after 2 years might actually work incredibly well for you, right? So that's a personal choice. And I think before, like going back 30 years ago, if in Ireland, for example, it would have been a very good idea to take a job like that, because people worked 9 to 5 and they had loads of free time. I think now a lot of people are living to work. And there seems to be this pushback. Well, we're told there's this pushback from Generation Z about the idea of living to work. But nonetheless, Generation Z are working incredibly long hours, just like all of the generations before them. And I think if you're somebody who's going to be living to work, your work is going to be a big part of your life. It's fundamentally important that you actually like what you're doing. And it's fundamentally important that you don't look for status. So you're not looking for a particular title, you're not looking for a particular salary, but you first talk about, what am I going to be doing on a day-to-day basis? Because if you don't do that, you're always going to be chasing something else. Because I can give you the fancy title today, Darren, but if you're somebody who's chasing titles, you will want another title after that, and you will want another title after that. But if you're somebody who's focused on, this is what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis, I need to be that I'm actually happy to get up in the morning, go and do those tasks, and I feel fulfilled afterwards, you will be much better off. And I'm not saying that you don't deserve to get paid. That's a separate thing. But at the same time, it can't all be about money, because if you're constantly chasing money, you will absolutely end up being not fulfilled with your life. Yeah,
exactly. And I think kind of setting those kind of like soft and kind of hard targets, we can kind of discuss that as well in the context of kind of career success. But often what I feel is that you're kind of chasing the next thing, and unless you register what you really want from the whole experience, it can just never end and going. I even give you a good example. I worked with a great company. It was actually based in Cork, called Newarka. Fantastic guy, Paul. And we had a client who was essentially a product owner. Just bring me back like 4 years. And I remember being super, super impressed by the guy. His name was Greg. He's based in Boston, and he was a PO. So basically, he was CFA, you know, chartered financial analyst, super intelligent guy. And I remember thinking in my head that like, that's what I wanted. And I was like, you know, super successful guy, young guy. And I was thinking in my head that, you know, his salary must be unbelievable. He's in a good role. And then as the years went on, and that was a nice hard target to get for myself. And now a couple of years later, I actually ended up getting into a product owner role in Revolut. And there was two sides to it, because I was extremely happy and very, very grateful that I'm there. And I even felt sometimes I don't even deserve it half the time. But there's that element of it, which is like, I would say 60% of it that I'm very, very happy for it. And then there's 40%, which is like, okay, what's next? Is it potential that I could go further and I could do it myself? Could I do something like this completely in a year and 2 years? And it's about stopping myself in the short term and saying that, okay, being happy with it, but then not being too aggressive with wanting to go for more and more and more. And that's probably my natural kind of like strive and kind of drive overall. But it was about registering that. I think those were younger kind of targets I had, and now they're quite different. They're a bit more fluid, trying to just go with the kind of motion a small bit more. But yeah, it's difficult, because you could lead you to being potentially kind of unhappy overall with that process.
And again, I think there's nothing wrong with being ambitious and wanting to accelerate and wanting to accelerate fast. And in when I wrote the book Think Big, it actually was for people who want to accelerate faster than what they're doing. Yep. So I like people who want to move fast, but I think they should be moving fast and enjoying the tasks and enjoying the process. And that's the key to cracking your career. So there's some people who really enjoy their job and they get underpaid, so they end up being miserable because they have financial stress. There's other people who don't like their job, but they're advancing and they're getting paid more, and they think that eventually they will be happy, and they probably never will. And then there's folk who really enjoy the process, but still advance quickly. And I think that's the sweet spot that people should be aiming for.
So digging into even that, that ambitious kind of side of it, especially with Think Big, it's a huge area that I really kind of like absorbed into. Some of the people that really become really successful, what is it that you kind of see, or what are the kind of underlying traits of that compared to what people would accelerate up, and then they kind of slow off and get into more of a stagnation period, which I kind of want to get into as well. But what are some of those kind of drivers that keep people on track? Because even for me, I always feel like that if I don't keep the foot on the gas, if I don't keep pushing, that's when I'll slow down. And the worst thing I want to be is kind of stuck in the middle, whereby you're kind of like halfway there and you're not really that successful or whatever. So I always want to try to keep pushing and pushing. What are the kind of most successful traits you'd see in those types of people?
So I think the first thing is kind of going back to the title of the book. People think big, right? So if you look at some of the most successful people in the world, they don't talk about incremental goals. So this idea that they're going to move forward a very small bit. They don't talk about 2 years' time. They don't talk about the next promotion. They have this big vision that they're ultimately aiming for. And then I think the second thing is habits. And that's where the take small steps comes from. So the idea that actually, yes, you have this big goal where there's no constraints, where you have this kind of blue sky thinking. But to get there, the only way you're going to get there is to embed really good habits in your day-to-day, in your day-to-day. And that doesn't mean working for now all the time. It means working for the future. So you're writing the CV for that person who you're actually going to be in the future. And then the third thing is courage. So, you know, in the book, I talk a lot about things like anticipated loss aversion. You mentioned, Darren, when you were speaking, sometimes I don't feel that I deserve it half of the time. Now that I'm a product developer, that's imposter syndrome in a different guise. So there's all of these things that actually will hold you back, which are your own psychology. And folk who manage to make it have all of those things, but they go to battle with them. And they challenge themselves, and they put themselves into the ring when it feels uncomfortable. And they put themselves forward again, even when they failed. And they put themselves forward again, even when things have been incredibly, incredibly unfair. And, you know, the thing that I would say to people who are really going to kind of try to move forward in their career, they absolutely need to think big. They absolutely need habits. So they need to take small steps, and they do need to have courage. And I think the last is to realize you cannot have a fear of standing out if you want to do well in the world. And what holds a lot of people back actually is they want everyone to like them, everyone to tell them that they're doing a great job, everyone to give them the pat on their back. And if you Google anybody from Elon Musk to people who are much less controversial, and you put into Google, I hate X, where X is the name, I can guarantee you there'll be a flood of people commenting on that person. And the reason that they are is you cannot make it to the very top of any pyramid without people disliking you. And they dislike you fundamentally, probably because you're thinking big, you're taking the small steps, and you have the courage to realize your own dreams. And that isn't embedded in us as human beings, you know, and those three things really do need to, particularly courage, particularly that last ingredient. Those three things are really worth paying attention to if you want to be successful.
Yeah, let's dig into even that part before we even go into the actions. I think all that area is just, it's what holds a lot of people back in terms of, I've heard people shutting down YouTube channels and podcasts and stop posting online because they finally break through the initial threshold. And then at that point, then that's when they're like, oh, you know, I've left the homogenous group of people over here, and now I'm doing something independently. And as a result, then that's when they can end up like, I don't know, they necessarily feel like they're an outlier, which is essentially what you want in that area. You know, if you're going to be a successful entrepreneur or successful like business leader, it's not the business leader that's the same as all the other ones. They're going to bring in those characteristics to be slightly different, and they bring in their own kind of niche. And I think that's what really makes people stand out. And you spoke a lot as well about imposter syndrome in the book. And I think that's so funny because I used to always view that as like, oh, you know, that wouldn't kind of happen to me. Like, it's fine, whatever. And it was in those exact examples whereby, you know, my YouTube's kind of got a bit more traction, my podcast got a bit more attention. And then especially my main role, when I started getting that kind of PO role, that's when I felt I'm not part of this league. You know, I shouldn't be here. People are going to look at me. People are going to look down on me. And I even see, you know, references in your book as well about how people don't really care about you that much. And that's so critical to the success of what you do, is the fact that you think that everyone is worried about what you're doing in the moment, whatever. And I remember in the early couple of months of it, because I've been in Revolut for about 1.5 years, but I've only been in this role for about 6 months or 3 months, 3-4 months. And in the beginning, I was like, everyone's going to think that, you know, I just stand out like a sore thumb. You know, I'm just not fit for this. I don't fit the vibe. I don't fit the role. No one was thinking about that. Maybe some people, but it could have came into their head when in one ear and out the other ear. So really what I'm taking from all this is that I just focus on the small incremental wins. Back to your task point, you know, like the small compounding effect. And I think the best way to explain that is, you know, most people reference it in terms of investing because it's numeric. You know, what's €10 today? It's nothing. That's small task. But €10 compounded over a couple of years, over a couple of centuries, a couple of decades, becomes monumental. And that's what I tried to focus in on the most. And I suppose it was the fact of when you're walking away from, you know, the kind of crowd is the biggest issue. But if you keep on pushing on, and that's why, you know, independently thinking is the best. Like, you know, you're based in London, I'm soon to be based in Singapore. When you're out there doing on your own thing, that's when, you know, usually the best creativity ideas and the best kind of interest will kind of prosper in that way.
I think you kind of hit on a couple of things that are really important. So firstly, the spotlight effect, which is that people aren't focused on you as much as you think they are, is fundamentally really worth reminding yourself of. So if you put yourself forward, like if you go on your YouTube channel today and you put out something that nobody likes, people aren't going to remember that in a week, right? And maybe that makes you feel bad, but it also should give you courage about putting yourself out there. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second is, well, not to focus on other people and comparing yourself to other people. So you should always be focused on, how did I progress this week? How did I progress this month? And if you do look at other people and you see their successes, you should see that as evidence that you can have the same successes. So never be jealous. Never kind of think, oh, I would love that. You know, why isn't it me? Nothing ever happens to me. But look at them and say, actually, you know, if people are looking at you, Darren, and, you know, you have your YouTube channel and it's growing, people can say, actually, Darren is growing his YouTube channel. That's evidence that it's possible. So now I'm going to try it in my own way, different to him. So now I'm going to try it. And I think that's a really good attitude when it comes to other people. So we celebrate their successes. We look to them as role models and for counsel and for advice. But fundamentally, you're not comparing your progress to somebody else. So if I go a bit slower than somebody who has a comparable career to me today, I don't sweat it, because there's probably something going on in my life that's different to what's going on in their life. And a lot of the times when it comes to careers, you can only see a very small amount of things that people are actually doing. Below the surface, there can be a lot, you know, there can be a lot of other things going on. So I would really encourage people to focus on their own game, basically. Take inspiration from others, but ultimately you're not in competition with anybody else.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I reference as well, about how, you know, you take in feedback from like your friends, from people, and thankfully due to my podcast, I've had some nice mentors, you know, that have really leaned in and gave me that kind of advice. But then when you're looking on like LinkedIn or any social media, there's always that kind of comparison element. But as I mentioned to you, like when I first started my role, you know, there was that extreme, like necessarily kind of anxiety, but more that kind of imposter syndrome, being like, I shouldn't be here. Whereas if you looked at it on LinkedIn, you would think the opposite. You would think, oh, this guy is super confident and he's so happy in his role, whatever. But that's just the opposite, you know? So I think when you're also looking at other people, that's when it amplifies. And that's when you feel very, very disgruntled. And I think it's the fact that everything on social media is so public that it's like, it taps into that part of your brain that it's like, okay, we're comparing stuff to others. And then it just amplifies it and turns it up significantly and much. And it kind of preys into that aspect of it, which is why it can be detrimental to your overall career. So then people end up not making those changes. And yeah, it's crazy. You know, it's crazy like that, you know. Even I want to dig into as well the aspect of loss aversion in there. So you're mentioning, you know, in your book about people taking risks and the fear of going kind of backwards, and the concept of loss aversion, for anyone who doesn't know. So like basically if you were to get a 10 euro today, you wouldn't see much benefit. But if you lost 10 euro tomorrow, you'd feel the pain of loss much more. Do you think the concept of like making changes and taking bigger risks and potentially going one step back to go 3 steps forward is stopping people from making those career changes and potentially pushing on in their career?
So I think the first thing is that very often you don't have to go back in order to make changes in your career. So you can make changes by keeping the job that you're in. Exactly, actually, your situation, Darren. You can keep the job that you're in, and then you can expand something out on the side. So in some ways, then you're de-risking, which actually in today's economy makes a lot of sense, because people have to pay rent and they have to eat. So I'm really a big fan of that. I think what holds people back isn't even so much loss aversion, so the losses themselves, but it's anticipated loss aversion, which is subtly different. So if you've ever asked somebody why they didn't go to for promotion in a particular year, and you thought that they were ready for promotion, very often there's this narrative that's given around the idea of being worried what other people would think when they failed, being worried that they would be turned down, not being sure how they would handle it. So it's almost like you're protecting yourself against something that never happened. And the most interesting thing about anticipated loss aversion is that it's been shown that the anticipation is a life experience in itself. You feel anxiety, you feel heightened blood pressure, all the physiological responses that you would get. Actually, if you were being attacked by a bear and you were anxious, you get those when you're anticipating something that you're anxious about. But had you gone through with it, the promotion, not being attacked by a bear, I wouldn't recommend the latter. Definitely put yourself forward for promotion. But if you've gone through with it, the impact on you is much less than what you anticipated. Because as people, we underestimate our ability to bounce back. And I think that's fundamentally really important, bearing in mind that you can create a whole world and a whole negative experience for yourself all in your head without the help of any colleague, any external person. any other impetus into your life. And that can negatively affect you, not just physically, so you make yourself sick, but it can also affect you that you don't put yourself forward for opportunities that you should be putting yourself forward for. And had you actually not sat in the moment of the storytelling to yourself and put yourself forward, even if it was the worst possible outcome, it's not going to be as bad as you anticipated.
It's crazy because we build up so much things in our head to think that they're not feasible. And we also put kind of roadblockers, but even in the promotion example is fantastic because a lot of people that I work with, a lot of young people, they think that they're not skilled or experienced enough to do it. So a lot of people will come back to me and they'll say, well, you know, you got a couple of years experience, you can kind of push around those interviews a bit more. And I would say, well, not necessarily. You know, they need, like, a hiring manager needs to fill a job. You're the person who needs to go for the role, or someone needs to get promoted and they're looking for someone. So in that area, you have a position of advantage, but it's you that's setting the limitations and putting that limited mindset on to say,
Yep.
you can't actually progress and make there, you know. And it's funny because a lot of people that I work with, I tried to practice obviously what I preach, and I would try to be a hard negotiator. So I would look at, you know, benchmark data, I would look at industry data, I'd look at across, you know, multiple different kind of, you know, whether it's my industry or I'd just feel very, you know, again, they'd be much more worried of a negative outcome. Whereas I've actually got feedback that people have said, we like that you're asking these questions because they're much more, it shows that you don't just settle for things, you know? Yeah. And that's crazy because I thought it was going to go the opposite direction a lot of times.
No, it's good. And I think as well, if you're interviewing and you ask for something, it's not going to impact you probably getting, I mean, maybe for 1 out of 10 persons it will, but for the majority of people, it won't impact you getting the job. And it actually will show that you're probably not just interested in the job itself, but that you're ambitious, both of which are qualities that are typically looked for in an interview. So I think, you know, once you're asking for something fair and it's not totally out of the ballpark, I would get on with it. And you know, again, really kind of just think about what's the worst that can actually happen. You get told no. So what? No one's going to remember that you asked that in 1 week's time or in 2 weeks' time.
Of course, of course. I want to get into kind of goal setting because there's, you know, numerous schools of thought about how that should be done. You know, as we discussed, you know, there's kind of your kind of approach whereby you're task driven and you're trying to get to that kind of endpoint, or else you could kind of, some people could set hard and fast rules. And looking at it in the context of salaries is salaries or like earnings is a great point. Because even for myself, I always remember kind of setting that like 100K salary. As you know, I want to get 100K. I remember I was 21 years old, chip on my shoulder, arrived in London. I was like, that's what I want. I want to get to that. I want to get that salary as quickly as possible. And then as time went on, I loosely had the idea, but then I also just focused on kind of batting out projects and go from project A to project B, and then naturally then just ending up in a good point. But how do you kind of think about kind of goal setting as a whole? Should it be hard rules like that initially, or should it be kind of soft rules that you adjust your plans accordingly to how life unfolds?
I think that the big goal that you have, the vision for the future, should be something that's really inspirational. It shouldn't have constraints. It shouldn't be trying to predict what's going to get in your way in 2 years' time or in 3 years' time, or that you're going to take a holiday. It should just be this kind of unlimited thinking. And then I think those small steps that you take to work towards the goal, whether it's building a new skill, getting experience, doing something different, making sure that you're getting paid for the value that you're actually adding. I think all of those things can be fungible depending on what life throws at you. And I think that's the beauty of having this long run goal, is that it allows you to take into account other things that might happen in life along the way. You know, some people will burn out, some people will have children, some people will get sick, some people will have other reasons that they need to actually kind of derail themselves from their goal. But you're only derailing in the sense that you're going to stop for a second, pull in, give yourself a break, and then come back to it in a way that's actually healthier for you. And then that long run inspiration is what allows people to do that. I think if you put something on yourself and say, I'm going to do something X in 2 months' time, you're really setting yourself up for failure. The chances of it happening, the world moves too slow in months, it moves quite quickly in years. So if you look back at yourself 5 months ago, not much will probably have changed. 5 years, most people can come up with a pretty lengthy list. Yet, if I asked you to look forward 5 years' time, most people don't come up with much. It sounds like they're not going to do anything. even people who are lifting for these kind of big goals. And the reason for that is that we find it very hard to imagine ourselves that far ahead. And I really encourage people to change that and to kind of sit with, what if it all worked out? So when you come up with a goal, just ask yourself, but do I, in this fantasy, I have no constraints. So what if it all worked out? What if it all worked out?
Yeah, looking through the constraint lens is super interesting, because people will often say capital is the first one. You know, you want to build a business, I don't have enough money, or you want to go somewhere, I can't do it, whatever. Or the holiday is a good example. Well, I don't want to take some. If I take some time off, I can't build a business. But that's not the fact. But recently, I had Mark Pollock on my podcast, you know, from Northern Ireland, and exactly to that point, he was like, people should go softer on their 6-month goals and harder on their 10-year goals. So their 10-year plan. And you know, when he went to the North Pole, he actually had the idea pretty early on when he went blind. He wanted to do big expeditions, but it took him 10 years to be able to do it. And obviously that's insane resilience and staying on the pad and focusing on it. But it's a very interesting way to look at it. It's like, yeah, we don't need to make everything happen overnight or even the space of a year. And then just to kind of let things happen over time and kind of get there. One area on the financial objectives. So I know you have a background in economics as well. And I think this is a very interesting for especially young people, kind of type A personalities, that they're very, you know, salary driven. Firstly, kind of like, why is it that we're always striving for these kind of big numbers, and why do we want to kind of focus on that big numbers? And really, does that kind of level off after a while? I've seen a couple of studies, of course, of when they reach their 80K or 90K kind of dollars, at that point, people's interests start to tether off and they go elsewhere. But there's also the other people that push through and keep on going. Now, I would nearly say that I'm in the latter bracket. I don't know, is it a good or a bad thing? But I think that's quite interesting to kind of discuss.
I mean, in some ways, putting numbers on things doesn't make a lot of sense, because in honesty, in today's economy, 80K isn't a lot of money to aim for, right? I mean, I think depending on what you want to do with your life, it's nowhere. I mean, if you think about what the salary distribution looks like in London, you probably would struggle to buy a house on 80K a year, right? So kind of that perspective, I think, can be interesting in itself. I think putting a number on it doesn't make a lot of sense, because it can be hard to think about when you're going to get the returns for the inputs that you're putting in this kind of linear way that some people seem to want to have. And what I would really kind of encourage people to focus on is A, getting paid your worth, and B, if you want to get paid more than your worth, you really need to focus on the narrative around why you're deserved. So become a really good storyteller. So the one thing that has been shown to give people an unfair advantage come salary time is the ability to kind of tell stories around their own performance. And this is particularly true in professional work where performance is noisy, like management consulting, people who are, in back offices in banks, for example, even investment bankers who are in teams rather than traders who are on the floor. This has been shown to matter. So the number I would really kind of encourage people to come away from. And instead, I would encourage people to kind of think about, are you moving forward at a rate that's satisfactory to you? And it might sound the same, but it is actually slightly different, because the latter doesn't rely on you waiting a year to get a kind of a promotions increase. It relies on you kind of looking for other opportunities for you to make kind of revenue at this moment in time that go beyond what's in your perfect periphery. So definitely not over focusing on one number. I think depending on the sector you're in, it will vary greatly. You know, we have some students who will start on 150,000 leaving LSE, and then you have some students who will start on 30 grand leaving LSE, and that really depends what sector did they choose to go into.
Of course.
And it's really worth bearing that in mind. So two things: know your worth within your sector, and then of course know your worth with respect to telling a story come, pay bonus time if you're reliant on someone to give you an increase, to make sure that you're getting paid your worth.
Yeah. How do you define that kind of fair wage, no matter what role it is, if it's investment banking, if it's in consulting or whatnot? And I know you do a lot of fantastic work on diversity and inclusion, and that's like, some of the work you've been doing there has actually been fantastic as well, because all the pay gap that we need to address, like, you've been really at the forefront of it. So that work has been amazing. But how do people especially if it's female or male, define that, and even the storytelling aspect of it. So I completely agree with you. As in, if you walk into that room, and this is how some big companies work. I know you do a lot of work with Citibank and so on as well, is that I have to argue my case provisionally before I go to my mentor in larger companies or to my direct line manager, and I convey that story. So let me give you a hypothetical example. I rolled out a project X, which generated X amount of revenue. We've had X amount of clients came in as a result, and there's zero amount of defects. And I can quite well, curate that narrative quite well. I'm decent enough at speaking, and it's not too bad. But I feel like other people who are more shy, who are less extroverted, might find that more difficult. And then obviously there could be a divide that comes as a result.
Well, there is a divide that comes as a result. So the hard part for me is that the advice for companies is very different to the advice for individuals. So companies really need to make things transparent. They need to be making sure that people get equal opportunities, visibility, and voice as a way to close the pay gap. And there's lots of different things that you can do around there. At the individual level, the problem comes because the people who ask for more are more likely to get more. The people who push the boundaries on asking are also more likely to get more, irrespective of their performance. And also people who are just like the culture within the business. So if you fit in, if you're a cultural fit, if you lack diversity, you're much more likely to be overpaid, which of course is bad for business. So part of my job on the one side of it is figuring out how companies can do much better pricing their talent. Most talent is replaceable, even though no one wants to hear that about themselves, but most talent is replaceable. So it basically means that, if somebody wants to be paid too much, letting them go is actually the right thing for the business. And on the second thing is then talking to individuals and saying, look, given that you're working for a company who doesn't have safeguards in place to make sure that people are paid their value to the business, how can you make sure that you get paid your value to the business? So how can you tell your story correctly? How can you make sure that you get your information out there? How can you improve your visibility and voice? So ultimately you're getting seen to get paid, because unfortunately in today's society, unless you're seen, you're never going to get an extraordinary wage, save for if you create a product that, like the COVID vaccine that ultimately gets sold and you get a big payday. But unless you're that inventor creating a huge product, if you're doing something incremental in the company, if you're showing up every day and doing tasks, even if you're an entrepreneur who's selling consultancy, you need to be seen to get paid.
Of course. I don't know how you think about this as well, but something that I kind of would speak to people on as well would be looking around. So as I mentioned about the benchmark, I'd use Glassdoor salaries because I can only use the data that's available to me. In general, anyone can. So what's available to me is Glassdoor salaries, LinkedIn salaries as well. You can benchmark a city or a role, and then I'd pull those numbers. And then what you can do as well is you can ask for the benchmark in the company. Now that's not often given. It's actually it's more likely not given, but you can also ask for it. And then if it's not asked for, you can just present the information that's external then, and then say, well, this is what the industry pays, and this is what other roles are paying. And then what I would advise is bringing that to the table of the conversation, because otherwise it's all just fugazi, isn't it? We're all just making up random numbers. And as you mentioned, like, we're getting paid differently. And as you become more experienced, especially in those managerial roles, it's up and down. Like there's no way that there's consistencies across the way, so that's why you have that ability to make movement if you're going to speak up and be more prominent in those conversations.
So the first thing, Glassdoor is an interesting data source. I use it myself in an index that we're creating, and the salaries are low. So they're on the low end compared to the reality. And that simply happens because people who are the highest paid don't fill out the forms. So in some ways you need to adjust then based on the fact that the data that you have is downward bias. I think if you're bargaining for a company and you're in the dark, in some ways it's better to let them reveal their offer first, because it will be in their distribution. So you have some way. So depending on where you are in your career, they might put you at the bottom of the distribution if you lack experience, or they might put you near the top if they might put you near the top if they think that you have a lot of experience. And I think then if it doesn't match your expectations, it's absolutely fine to say, I was expected to be paid X. Can we have a conversation about this? Because I really want to I really want to work in the company. And then that's kind of where the negotiation ends up, the negotiation ends up being. If you're in a smaller company, it can be better to reveal your hand first. But I think in a bigger company, because these distributions are set, there would never be a case where somebody who's new would be offered a salary that's off the distribution today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they're salary bands. That's kind of how they work in general.
Exactly. So if you don't know the band, you let them reveal them. You can let them reveal it, and then you can try and adjust it to the expectations that you actually had. And then the conversation will flow much easier than if you go in with a salary that's much lower than the distribution. You're probably going to be offered that salary.
Yeah. And I think as well, something interesting there as well is to play like the waiting game. I often feel, even in myself, people are very, fast to accept offers and just take it and just be like, okay, that's it. Just take it and walk away. So kind of being a bit more patient, letting them, reveal their hand first. And it's part of negotiation as much as you like it or not. It's a sales process, I suppose, and it's getting the most out of your situation. One thing I want to get into in detail as well that you actually mentioned children, which plays in very much into it as well, is the concept of like, stagnating your career or not necessarily pushing on. So it could be paternity, maternity leave, whatever factor that has let you being pretty, you've rose, let's say an example, and then you've started to taper out a small bit. In those instances, how do you kind of reignite your kind of career or push on again? Is there a fundamental change that kind of happens, and why is it people kind of fall into those brackets? Is it more life events or versus kind of talent and skill and as you said, discoverability of people seeing what you do?
I mean, I think the first thing is that you need to control the narrative around it. So, people rightly say that the gender pay gap is worse for women who have children. And it's about a third. So about a third of the gender pay gap can be explained by comparing women who have children to women who don't have children. And then that has to be something to do with this time out of the workforce, this 1 year. And that is some of it. But I think the other part of it is that there's a belief among people within companies that once a woman takes time off to be with her child for 1 year, that they are out of the labor force. And that belief is damaging. So if I come back and I'm raring to go and I'm really excited after my maternity leave into a company, and fundamentally my colleagues believe that I'm on a mummy track and that I'm not as engaged as I was before, I'm going to have less opportunities, less voice, and less visibility. And because of that, I'm going to get, less likely to be promoted and a bigger pay gap. So in some ways, there's the time out that everyone points to. This is the reason, this is the reason, this is the reason. And we're not tackling the narrative, the fundamentally, that when women come back after maternity leave, they are treated differently. And they are treated differently, regardless of whether they have childcare available, regardless of whether they've come back with a full-time nanny. There are those differences on what we call the on-ramp when they come back. And I think if you want to make sure that doesn't happen to you, whether you've gone on maternity leave or for a sabbatical or for some other reason you've taken time off, you need to make sure that when you come back on that on-ramp, that you're back getting the level of opportunities, visibility, and voice that you would expect. And it's really difficult in that situation to safeguard that because you are at your most vulnerable. You've just taken a year off. So having, someone come back into the company and be incredibly demanding at that moment is probably going to be difficult for colleagues to kind of take on board. But I think you're better off doing that than just allowing, the kind of status quo unfold with you being treated differently. So really controlling the narrative about you coming back, making clear that you're back, that you're there to work, being very clear on the hours that you're willing to do without overburdening yourself, and then just get on with the job.
Yeah, you're dead right, because it's like when you come back, or if for anyone, even if it's not to do with a maternity leave, when you come back to work, you're ready, you're fit and able. That's the whole purpose. You're not coming back to be half in the door or whatever. So at that point, then it's just lights back on. It's business as usual, essentially. Yeah. What about for the other bracket of people that, spike up in their career and then they start leveling out? What would you kind of advise to, really kick up your career again? Because I feel like that's obviously, a big kind of fear of myself is that you just level off and you never really push on to become a director or lead a company or start, another company or whatever. Is there something you would advise in that scenario? Maybe a shift in attitude or a shift in activity or getting into the tasks? What would you advise?
I think go back and make a think big goal again. So really say, kind of paying attention to what's the next step for you that you would absolutely love to take if there were no constraints, so that there were no boundaries, including this plateau that you've found yourself in. And then make sure that you embed habits that push you towards that goal. And, ultimately, if you've plateaued in one company too long, that might mean that you have to move. It might mean that you have to be mobile and go somewhere else, and not being afraid of that as well, if what you want to do is accelerate. Now, I will say that there's going to be a lot of people who are really, really happy being at a particular level. So, if you end up being at a VP level in a large organization, you love your day-to-day, you have good work-life balance, you're fundamentally content to get up and go to work, then that's an amazing role for you. There's absolutely no reason why you have to be always pushing yourself to the next milestone, to the next milestone, to the next milestone. But if it's something that you want and you find yourself stuck, stepping back, taking that time to think big, the small steps, what can I do? What can I control? So don't worry about other people, your colleagues, those other people in your periphery. What can I actually control to move ahead? And then the last thing, which I said in the beginning of the podcast, have some courage. So have some courage, put yourself out there and start moving.
Yeah, I think because it's like the mindfulness again of all the other biases of other people, what you're thinking. That's what's restricting people, I suppose, and that's what's holding people back. And that's kind of exactly what I kind of want to get into. So the last kind of part was around, your thoughts around it as well, like your own internal thoughts about when you want to make career changes. Because I think for younger people, the new kind of attitude is like 2 years, 3 years maximum. You're kind of plateauing and you want to move on to some new opportunity. But I suppose an older generation they're much longer in careers. They've got good success from it. And their criticism of younger people is, well, we've had this success in this role, so you don't necessarily need to move. But I think younger people then are getting now caught up in the opportunities of, well, I should keep on moving. I should go to new opportunities because LinkedIn is providing those inbound opportunities. You can switch on a light on LinkedIn, get 10 messages a week. And it's difficult, it's difficult to understand what's a narrative that I really, really want to complete.
I mean, the first thing is that, moving jobs is costly. So it costs the person who moves an awful lot. So they have to go to a new company, they have to retrain, they have to get embedded in the politics, they have to get embedded in the culture. So up to a certain point, it makes a lot of sense to move, but there will be parts in people's careers where actually it's really a bad idea. And I think it becomes a bad idea when there are opportunities available for you to grow that are outside your current employer, that you could be exploiting without making the move. And from individual to individual, that trade-off needs to be made. So I think fundamentally, the idea that people should move 2 to 3 years and then other people stay for 10 years, I mean, I think neither is right. But I think the question is, if I'm in a particular role, am I still growing? If I'm not growing, am I content? And if I'm not content, what am I actually doing about it? And that last part, what am I actually doing about it, can be I moved roles, or I start developing something for myself outside of my current role, like a side hustle, if I don't feel necessarily ready to move. But the what am I doing about it is the question. I wouldn't move for the sake of moving, because you will miss opportunities. And ultimately, it costs you time. You interview, you go into a new company. People who are just in the company will never get large pay increases, really, unless their front office income generator is in an investment bank, or they're creating the product. Unless you're a core income generator, you won't be getting a huge increase within a year of being in any big company. So there has to, if you're chasing money, it needs to be that with every move you do get a pretty large pay increase. But if you're chasing happiness, I really will kind of sit back and say, maybe I'm getting it wrong and choosing the wrong company. And what I need to be doing is choosing a company that I know that the tasks and the activities that I'll be doing on a day-to-day basis are the ones that are right for my personality.
Yeah, it's a complicated mix as well, because when you have the salary up in the air as well, like I really wouldn't suggest moving salary or moving company for a salary unless it's 30-40% increases. Genuinely, unless the jump is that much, because even if it's 10 or 15%, you could probably get that in your existing role by just arguing the case. If you go back and you're thinking of, I'm thinking of leaving, is there an opportunity to improve like the salary? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And if it isn't, then you might consider, and you can kind of weigh up those kind of options. And also as well, you made a great point about doing stuff on the side. So I always feel like that I just need things on the side. I need like a creative outlet. I need just something just a little bit different. I feel if I was working, which I do, like super, super long hours in Revolut, and then just went to bed at the end of the day, I'd hate it. I'd like the fact that I just have other aspects. So maybe that's what other people are lacking, is the fact that their existing role could be okay. They might want to try something else, but they could just kick up something on the side. And it doesn't have to be a big commitment, kind of like what I'm doing. It can be a couple of hours a week. Something small, might not even be profit driven. It could be just something that excites you outside of your regular role. And that's where you go back into the VP position, whereby you do have a good work-life balance and you're happy with that position.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with that.
Yeah, it takes a lot of just, I think, more like sense to kind of like settle on it and understand what the right direction is. Last area I want to discuss is around just context, super, super briefly. So, working from home, now we're at a situation whereby we're going back to offices, a lot of roles. You have some companies which are moved to completely remote situation. What would you advise for people who are in between going back to offices and staying at home? I mean, that's a difficult situation that's kind of happening at the moment.
I mean, in some ways, I think for that to work, the person who's managing you needs to be really good at running hybrid and virtual meetings. So in some ways that's out of your hands. But if you're finding yourself that you're kind of, left to the side, trying to engineer it so that the meetings and the times that you actually come together with this person who ultimately determines whether you get paid more, whether you get promoted, whether you get opportunities. And opportunities is something that probably is the most important, that they actually know that you're there and that the meetings are run a bit better. But I think the second thing is really making sure that you understand work-life balance. I talk about this a lot and I'm really bad at it, but it's really difficult if you work a lot at home not to let your work spill over into your life, which fundamentally I think in the short term does make you much more productive. So you're much more productive if you do just allow it to spill over and you get more done. But in the long run, you will burn out. So really getting people to protect their time, to protect their boundaries. And I think the interesting thing about boundaries is I often hear people saying, oh, well, he or she doesn't respect my boundaries. And I think you need to realize that the boundaries that we have in our life that we actually set, do I work on a Saturday? Do I take calls after 7 p.m.? Am I checking emails at 9 at night? That those boundaries are your own boundaries. They're there for you. They're not there for anybody else. And it's up to you if you let people bash them down. And if you do, you're going to be worse off from it. So saying that somebody has no boundaries never makes any sense to me. The person who needs to have, if you want somebody to respect your time, to respect the perimeter that you've put around your private life at home, you need to be the one to say no to those tasks. And I think the biggest trick is A, figuring out a way that you manage to stay in touch with your office, and B, figuring out a way that you have boundaries that actually work for you in your life so you don't end up being exhausted.
It happens too much in tech roles as well. Slack integration, it's just that it's too easy to respond and it's too easy to just be always involved. And, that's one thing that I'm trying to do, like as like a kind of young manager, is kind of speak to my own kind of team to be like, look, we don't need to be connected 24/7.
Yeah.
You just need to weigh in when we're weighing in. You don't need to have your phone on when you're off. When you're off, you're off. And if shit hits the fan, well, then we'll find something. We'll solve it some way, So different ways to do it. And I know you've mentioned before about unless you're like a heart surgeon or the prime minister, you don't necessarily need to have your phone on 24/7.
So I think Boris probably doesn't have his phone on 24/7. I'll be honest with you. I mean, the surgeon, I really do want to have their phone on 24/7. If Boris turns this off, I'm not sure it will make that much of a difference. To be very honest. But no, it's true. Most of us kind of invent these narratives about our jobs that we're firefighters or heart surgeons, and we're fundamentally not. And actually, if there's an hour before we respond, if there's a day, even if there's a week, very often not much is going to happen. And actually, if it's an emotional situation, it might have actually calmed down if you give it a little bit of time. So heart surgeons and firefighters should keep their phones on. I think the rest of us can take a break.
That's so funny. Absolutely. Grace, I'll just say a massive thank you. And where can people find your book and where can people find yourself?
Yeah, so I have a website, www.gracelordan.com. You can subscribe to a newsletter. There's information on the book and a bunch of other resources. So if you want to get in touch or want to keep up with my work, just register on there.
Amazing. And I'll have everything in the show notes as always. So be
Brilliant.
right and easy for listeners. So again, thank you so much.